Today on 13th and Park, we welcome one of the most dynamic leaders in Washington, Doug Collins, the United States Secretary of Veterans Affairs, a former Air Force chaplain, and Georgia congressman. Collins has brought a combat zone sense of urgency to transforming how America treats its veterans. Join me for a conversation about service, sacrifice, and what it should mean to come home. From Ballard Studios in the nation's capital, it's 13th and Park.
I never dreamed going into the White House you'd risk your freedom.
We in Congress will act together when we have to act.
They deserve better, and we owe them some results.
I believe this country's best days continue to remain ahead.
I had no idea the monster we unleashed.
I play every night, and people love it. They're going berserk.
Well, I don't have any Emmy Awards behind me yet, but,
I'm sure they're coming.
I'm so glad to be here on 13th and Park.
Mr. Secretary, great to have you on the show today. I'm really impressed by people that have given themselves to serve this country, as you have. But you've had a very interesting journey where you went from being pastor to a military chaplain to a member of Congress and now, of course, the Secretary of Veterans Affairs. Is there like a thread that links all those experiences together where people say, well, on reflection, yeah, that makes sense that he's where he should be?
Yeah, I believe it's God's hand. I mean, I say that some people think that's a casual statement, but I don't believe it to be a casual statement. I believe if you look at my life and you look at a life of service, I believe that's where I was headed. My dad was a Georgia State Trooper for 30-something years. My mom took care of senior adults and took care of us. And I saw that just lived out in their examples of public service, that there's something about being a part of this country that, just draws you to lead. And the way you lead is by helping others. So for me, going from a life and say, I can take a little bit of my life. So anybody listening to this podcast, I want to encourage you. The old words of Theodore Roosevelt, bloom where you're planted, because I can look back over my life and see, working in business early on where I thought I was going to law school and I ended up in business, then going into seminary and I get my master's and pastoring for 11 years, then going to law school, getting elected to office, getting elected to Congress, and now being here. I see bits and pieces of that drive me every day. As a secretary of VA right now, I'm a better secretary of the VA because of my 11 years as pastoring. I'm a better secretary because of my 8 years in Congress. I'm a better secretary because of spending 4 or 5 years on the road, selling. So I think it's just all a matter of coming through. So the single thread, though, is being personal, knowing how to relate a message, knowing how to win people over, how to work with them, but also make decisions. And I think God just sort of led me along that path.
Well, you've said before that it's kind of the credo, it seems, for your service now as Veteran Secretary, that you want to meet veterans where they are.
Yes.
What does that mean?
That means going to them. We have this real problem in government that government pops up something and we expect people to just, naturally be drawn, or we have a program that is something that we expect them to take part in and view it as if they don't, that it's their fault. Well, veterans are different in that respect, in that they've earned the benefits that we've had. They're not anything based on anything else except one thing. They raised their right hand. They said, I'm willing to go do what others, almost 98% of this country, is not going to do. And that is serving our military. And one of the things that set this apart for me is death by suicide numbers in this country of veterans, whether it be 17 to 40, ranging however you want to cut the number. What we found out was we're spending $500 million over that for preventative services to try and keep people from that area. But yet 60% of those who did actually complete that tragic end were not touched by the VA in some way. So that told me we were talking to the choir. And so we've got to get out to where they are. That's why we do podcasts. That's why we do interviews all the time. That's why I go to sporting events. That's why we've done game day. And we're getting ready, hopefully, to do some stuff with UFC and some others as we go, because that's where we know that veterans are. I had a great just past weekend spending time with veterans who just deployed and came back, and older veterans in Pittsburgh. It was just a fabulous time.
But it really brings it back for you, doesn't it? Because you can really put yourself in their shoes, Brad,
yes.
and know exactly what they experienced, what they hope to come back to, which, of course, is where the challenge begins for a lot of veterans, doesn't it?
Oh, it does. Transition back home, whether it be transition back home from a deployment, which I have been on, I just mentioned those veterans in Pittsburgh I talked with the other day. We were talking about deployments. I was able to turn to one of the colonels and lieutenant colonels. And he was sitting there and we were talking about it. And I said, well, y'all still on that new deployment cycle, wing deployment cycle? I knew what they were talking about because I've done it. And he said, and then we sort of laughed because, of course, the Air Force changes the deployment cycle again in the way they're doing it. But it was something we could relate to. So it was not just a cabinet official standing there and, with the national anthem. It was something we could relate to. And he told me, he said, well, I'm getting ready to be with y'all in about 6 months. I'm retiring next spring. I said, hey, we're ready. And so it's a good thing when you can relate. I call it navigating. Navigating is when you take the lead and you know where you're going because you've been there. And we need a lot of that in our government, and especially with our veterans. They need to know that we respect those who've been in the same places and done the same things, sort of been in the same mud, if you would.
Well, there's so many issues, obviously, that are on your plate: housing, employment, healthcare. To you, what's maybe first up in terms of your priorities that you really want to go after, and maybe basically send a message to every veteran that we have your back?
That's an easy one. You've made a lot of program issues there, and I agree with all of those. Yes, I'll say yes to all of those. But the first thing we have to do, and we're just getting there, we've had a great year so far, the VA employee has done a great job, is we had to just rechange the mindset of the VA, that it's about a veteran, it's not about our organization. I mean, we're almost as bad as the old court from my lawyer days. The courts will act on precedent. Well, this is the way I was taught, this is the way done, whether it actually affected the veteran or not in a positive way. So we've redone that to say we're about the veteran, and if it works for the veteran, then that's what we're going to be looking at doing. So I think for me, it's the mindset at the top. It's about the standard. The standard will always be the standard. The standard for us is helping veterans. So from there, those issues that you just talked about programmatically are then based off that one standard, so that we know when we go out, our organization is built for one purpose, and that's to take care of veterans in those many different facets.
Is there one you're hearing more about than the others? I mean, housing's affecting, of course, every American. Healthcare affects every American. But are you hearing more about one in particular these days that you're really going after?
It really depends. I think there's certain areas. I mean, healthcare is a growing need among our veterans, and being able to not only get direct care service, but also community care service, which the president is very much on. He signed the Mission Act during his first term, and it got put on the hold during the Biden administration. Now we're bringing it back so that veterans can get quicker care, access to community doctors, plus the direct care. Housing, our homelessness initiatives, the president is also signed an executive order for homelessness that we're implementing in West LA, but we're also doing that all over the country with our hospitals reaching out into their communities to find veterans who need housing, getting them into temporary shelters where need be. Of course, we've already mentioned suicide, the mental health issues there that go along with that. That's a rising concern. But there's also a concern, and I just want to express it to those maybe listening to this podcast. Judge the VA as a healthcare system, especially our biggest part of us is a healthcare system, not this unique, special kind of healthcare system that Congress sometimes seems to want to think we are so that they can make political points about what we do. But we're the same as all the other major healthcare systems. We still have the same struggles, and that is, finding new doctors, finding new nurses, finding those kind of folks in the clinical side that everybody has the issue with. So it's sort of frustrating at times when members of Congress say, well, why are you having not being able to hire all these doctors? And I want to simply ask them, I said, have you went to your private and public health care systems in your district and ask them the same question, because they have the same question. And actually, in many areas, we're doing better than they are.
It must help having a president who is built for speed and wants to change, right? You must have more of an open playing field to do these kinds of things you're talking about, perhaps than other secretaries have had before you.
We do. I worked with this president back when I was in Congress because we had to go through the Russia hoax and all that other, crap when I was in there, the impeachment stuff. So I've worked with him for a long time and worked with the team in the 4 years that he was out. So it was really 8 years getting ready for a new 4 years. And I think what he's came into, and he told me to simply say, let's take care of veterans. It's made it a lot easier for me because all I have to do is say, I'm taking care of the veteran. I'm showing him in a cost-efficient manner. I'm showing it in a efficiency standard and saying, here's what we need to do. And so when I talk to him and I bring him stuff, it's very good. He looks at me and he says, okay, Doug, I get it. Let's do it. And so it's and I don't have to bring a lot to him. He just says, go do it. And him and Susie Wiles as chief, she has been wonderful to work with as well. So we get to make the changes need to happen.
You've said before, we need more people who run toward the fire, not toward the cameras, right? What that is another way of saying leaders who are willing to make tough decisions. Is there an example of that, in your first number of months on the job where you had to kind of make that kind of call knowing it's not an easy one?
Yeah, there's been several instances where we've had to just, make the call to say, look, we're not staffed in the right way. We did not have to end up riffing anybody or laying anybody off, but we offered a pretty large early retirement program in which we protected almost all of our healthcare workers and said, no, you can't be a part of this. Is it always hard to see people leave and to take part? Yes, it is. But it also goes back to the issue is, what were we doing? Was it affecting a veteran? And I think that's the big key. Also, we've had to make calls on, what programs we're going to have, those kind of things that have worked out. So the biggest thing, though, is training our workers here to realize accountability matters. Mm-hmm. And that you may have friends that you've worked with, but if they're not doing the job, they either need to be retrained to the job or it's time for them to leave. And I think those are always tough decisions that need to be made. We want to keep everyone, but we also want everybody working to a standard that says we're doing the very best that we possibly can. It's time for interviews after the fact, but in the first, when things are going where they need to, I need people who are willing to make decisions. And we've given our senior leadership something they've never had. We've now allowed them to make decisions on a local hospital level and district level and said, look, you make the decisions. If you're doing it for the right reasons, we're going to have your back. We may have to change, a few things later, but we want to make sure you're actually doing what you need to do.
How do you see technology, especially AI, changing the way you can reach and effectively serve veterans?
It's going to be an interesting way to look at it. For us, it's very sensitive. I mean, there's a lot of concern on the Hill and other places that you don't want to go to this mindless sort of AI perspective where things are decided without human input because we're dealing with veterans' lives and they're very complicated. But we can really help us in different ways, such as our comprehensive exams, those exams in which we're looking to actually cut down greatly the need for sending the veteran to a doctor to say, yes, this is what you have, this is service connected, because a lot of that is actually already in the file itself. And if we can use technology to help us look at that, get that information to humans who can say, yes, let's just move them on through, we don't have to spend that. We could save literally billions of dollars by cutting some of that out. It also helps us with, processing educational benefits, processing home loans. Those are the kind of things that will always be there. And then you have the intangibles, which are really exciting, is how they can actually help us in our healthcare. Doctors across the country, across different healthcare systems, are using AI and radiology and a lot of others that have been shown to really enhance care in what we're doing. So there's a lot of ways we can do it, but there'll always be the human touch there as well here at the VA.
I like quoting you, by the way, a lot. So I'm gonna throw something at you that you said before. You said, if you've worn the uniform of this country, you've already done more for America than most will ever be asked to do. Yeah, the reality of your situation and where you're serving today is you have veterans coming from different generations. Yep. And to try to figure out how do we best serve those who served in Vietnam, and then fast forward to those who recently come back, say, from Afghanistan. How do you kind of square that out so all veterans are getting kind of the same treatment, the same service that they deserve?
I think it's understanding again, what is our target audience? Our target audience is one group of people, veterans, period. That's all we have to serve. So you've hit an interesting point. I brought this up to senators in my confirmation that we're really dealing with several different groups right now. We still have World War II veterans. We have Korea veterans. We have Vietnam veterans into the early 80s, sort of that silent Cold War kind of issue. They have more of traditional needs. They understand the traditional VA, the VSO structure. They relate to that. You start getting into Desert Storm, GWAT, now those are the Gen X generation, the millennial generation, which are much more independent, much more non-joiners. So you have to look at how they affect, but you also have, frankly, in some of our GWAT generation, more injuries of catastrophic injuries, multi-trauma injuries. They were coming back without arms and legs in many cases, living longer, healthier lives, even after that fact, but having to deal with the after effects of their injuries. So whereas they might have passed away in previous conflicts, they're now living. So it's changed how we adapt. Toxic exposure, a lot of those things have changed. So it's basically just adapting to the needs and the areas of where our veterans are living. And I think our doctors are doing a pretty good job of that. But it's just reaching out differently. I can reach a Vietnam veteran much more in one way than I can a GWAT veteran. They just respond differently.
So I've heard you keep, to this very day, paracord bracelets and dog tags of fallen service members you personally met. Is that your reminder of where you are and who you serve and a mission, because, it's all about mission first. Is that how you just keep grounded?
And that is definitely one of the ways. I have a paracord bracelet that was given to me by a young security forces airman in Iraq. And she gave it to me because she said, you're always giving us something and I want to give you something. And it reminds me of everyone that I've served with, both deployed and non. I keep my dog tags out. If you were to come to my office at this very second, you would see on top of one of my coin cases, those two pieces of memorabilia, if you want to call it that, but they're reminders of why we do what we do. And I keep those kind of things around to remind us that we do this because of the person who's not there. And I encourage all of our departments to remember, you may be making decisions about your departments in terms of your department, but remember there's somebody that you're going to be serving that's not in that meeting. And that's who you need to be looking at. And that's that veteran that we're supposed to serve.
Is there still a story that kind of rumbles through your soul that is, again, a grounding element in your life?
I think there's many. Yeah, I actually have a two-part story. I was in the Navy for a short time as a chaplain candidate out in San Diego at Camp Pendleton, got to serve with the Marines. And then I got out for about 6-7 years, I guess it was, and then came back into the Air Force right about 2002. So within that first year, we lost a Black Hawk helicopter who went down from Moody Air Force Base. And I can remember that being one of the first big televised sort of memorials that happened. And I was a part of that. And I can still very vividly remember the families and the service that went with that and how it really just shook that community. All the way to deployment times where I watched some of the best and brightest this country has to offer. I got to have dinner with them in the middle of the night in the desert as we laughed and talked about home. Those are kind of stories that really come back to me. But there was one in particular that really got to me. And you got to remember back in 2008, there was this young airman, and I came to a gate one night, and there was nobody at the gate. Well, I waited. We're on the other side of the base. Nobody came. And so I started looking around and said, well, did everybody go home and forget me? And about that time, this young A1C comes out of the back. And he's, oh, chap, I'm sorry, sir. I apologize. I said, well, I'm okay. You don't have to say anything to me, but if the captain had come by, you'd have been in trouble. And he starts laughing. And then I said, what were you doing? Because as a chaplain, I get to sort of mentor and sort of correct them without them feeling like, hey, I'm getting ready to have things done. So I said, what were you doing? And he said, well, last year before I entered, and he hadn't been in but about a little over a year or so, my dad did construction, and we didn't have a lot because there was no work, and my brother and sister didn't get anything for Christmas. And he said, now that I'm making big money, and I always thought this was hilarious, here's an A1C, making big money. He said, I was making my budget out, and he said, here's how much I needed. And he said, I was wanting to make sure that I could send enough home so I could get my sister, who was starting college, a computer, and he wanted to get a bicycle for one of his brothers. And that just epitomized to me. I drove away, even to this day, with sort of tears in my eyes, thinking that's the people that join. That's the people that serve us. So for all those people out there who want to hate on veterans, this secretary, that don't fly real well, because that's the best and brightest. He didn't have to go anywhere. He chose to raise his hand, and out there in the middle of the desert, even in the middle of the night, he was thinking about other people. That's what I find with so many veterans all the time.
Well, very clearly, Mr. Secretary, this is not about policy. It's a personal thing for you.
Oh, very much.
Serving veterans. And I really appreciate that. And we all appreciate, of course, your service. And we all understand that if this nation truly values its veterans, they've got to show that. And they should show that every day. We're so happy you're leading this effort now. We're very confident that you now serve with a president who is backing you, I'm sure, every step of the way to get there, to show veterans that we mean it, that we really appreciate and value them and their service. And as I said earlier in this interview, that we've got their back.
Yep, I agree. It's a great time. I thank you for letting me be on.
Godspeed.
Thanks.